Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched the first season of Reacher from, I believe, 2022. So, I haven't watched TV shows in a long time. In fact, one of the last TV shows I watched was the last one I watched on this show, which was what's it called? The Mandalorian season 1. And so, having not watched TV in a long time, I randomly ended up watching the first episode of this show, not necessarily intending to jump into it, but finding myself pretty quickly hooked into it. And I'm glad I went through with watching it, because this show has a lot of good things going for it. Most of all, for this particular point, it has great pacing that keeps you engaged over a not short series. I mean, it's 8 episodes that I think are an hour each-ish. And it does a really good job of keeping you engaged the entire time, while also giving a lot of breathing room that is absent in a lot of other things like it. So before we get into that, let's talk about Jack Reacher and the Reacher series, something I didn't know very much about. Now, I was pretty sure I had watched the Jack Reacher movies with Tom Cruise. And in fact, I was pretty sure I had watched them for this series. But unless I have magically deleted all copies of those videos and all my memories and all files that would have been left behind from me making it, I never made videos about those, despite the fact that I watched them less than 2 years, or about 2 years ago, I think. According to my records, that's when I watched them. So it would have been while this show was going. And they are so unremarkable and unmemorable that apparently I didn't think they warranted making videos about. It's possible I may have mentioned them off to the side in some other video. So if you happen to be a diehard fan of this show and can remember when that was, let me know. But fascinating to realize that my memory of them was very hazy, to say the least. I went through and skimmed, after finishing this show, I went through and skimmed both those movies to see how much I remembered. And I do remember bits and pieces. I know I did watch them, but man, they are so unmemorable and so without any real charm, it's notable in how kind of bad I think they are. And in fairness, I don't remember them that clearly, so maybe they're slightly, but man, skimming through them for like half an hour, I was not impressed. And that may have been what put me off this originally, because I think this show came out a little bit before. I think I probably watched those movies thinking I should watch them before this show. Also, I think there was another Jack Reacher show with John Krasinski that came out a few years before. But maybe I'm mixing that up. Hold on a second. I'm not crazy, right? Jack Ryan. Man, these okay, not the same, but man, the generic white guy who is a probably some kind of military veteran or, former government officer of some kind is a genre unto itself. But I digress. Anyway, so I don't know why I never got around to watching this show, because I was actually pretty excited for it based on some recommendations I had about it around the time that it came out. And I'm glad that I finally got around to it, because it has a lot going for it that movies for this same property and others of its ilk, obviously, many of which we've watched on this show, do not match. Some of that is going to be natural as a result of being a movies versus a full-length TV show of sorts. Although full length, I don't know, 8 episodes these days starts to seem like an American miniseries, but I digress. This takes a lot more time to do what it needs to do, and is really had me thinking as I was watching it in comparison not only to things like it, whether it's the other Jack Reacher films, whether it's the Mission Impossible type stuff, whether it's any of the other things that come sort of in that same vein. And we've watched a lot of films on this show that kind of come into the same sort of flavor. They are sort of modern-ish, spy-ish type films with some level of, domestic and international intrigue and all these other things. And what really stands out just as an aspect of a different type of media is that giving your show, a full-length show, the time to breathe really lets lots of different things stretch their legs and become more full-fledged. Obviously, one of those is going to be the characters themselves, who are going to have more opportunity to both have screen time and develop a narrative arc for themselves, but also just to have dialogue between characters. It really struck me watching this show just how much of many of the movies sort of in this genre are very action oriented. They do not have any time to breathe, and skimming those the Jack Reacher films, that was immediately apparent as well, of just like at most any scene of talking has about 2 minutes maybe where there isn't either violence going on or the threat of violence happening. And one of the things I most appreciated about this film was just how much time it spent on investigation. Now, I would still say this like errs towards the side of being an action show, but that's very generic and very broad, obviously. It seems to be aiming at an audience that's a little bit more interested in a typical action movie, but at the same time, it is definitely courting seems to be at least catering to audiences a little bit more in between, whether that's the likes of police procedurals, which this show has a substantial amount that's sort of in that vein, whether it's mystery fans or crime crime show fans, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a lot to be appreciated regardless of necessarily what side you may be coming from, or if you have multiple interests in that area. I will say that depending on the episode, you may like certain episodes dramatically more or less. I certainly did. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the later episodes are likely to have more action in them, for better or for worse. In my particular case, I thought that the moments when it was more action heavy were almost universally the least compelling scenes, that the times when characters had development, when they could, have conversation with each other, when they could investigate what was going on around them, when they could banter, when they could bicker, all of those are the things that, me by now, I engage with the most and find most interesting. A crime or spy thing that doesn't give any time for intrigue to build is usually a bad one. And this has ample opportunity to let those things build up, to let the intrigue develop, to let you think about what's going on, and also to reflect on some aspects of what you do know versus what the characters know. Now, this is a thing we've talked about a bunch of times before, but this show does a pretty good job of it, but it does err on both sides of being a problem, where there are times where structurally the show does immediately give the viewer far more information than the characters have, and that is deliberate to sort of hook the viewer and give them a lead into what's going on that the characters will then investigate. It's not so much of a problem because it's contrary to like a problematic mystery in that vein where you'd just be frustrated by the characters not getting it yet when they, you have the results you have the answer to a puzzle or something like that. This is much more about giving some framework for the viewer to look at that will give them an influenced view of what the characters are about to do and the things that may result from their choices. So I think it's very engaging in that way, not really a problem. It does flip on the other side as well of this issue though, where there are a few too many times, for my taste, not a huge number, but a few too many, where the show seems to pull something out of its butt a little bit. Not that it's not valid, but more that, and not that it's not valid or believable, but more that the characters are a little bit ahead of the viewers in that case, where there are some things where you can say, oh, I'm, episodes ahead of these characters on who's responsible for these things. But the intermediate steps are sometimes they seem to come out of the blue a little bit. They feel a little less satisfying and a little less valid because it seems like less of an intelligent development and a discovery and more of a reveal done by the narrative for the sake of pushing things forward. That is a little bit harder to get right than the former, side of this issue. So I'm not going to lay a huge amount of blame on that, but I think it could have been done a little better. Generally speaking, though, I will say I think that the pacing throughout the film, or I keep saying film because that's the norm here, throughout the show is pretty good. Up to the last episode in particular, and really the last two episodes a little bit, where it starts to lay a little bit too heavy into the action side of things for my taste. I just think that they could have spread it out a little bit better. I wouldn't have minded if there was quite as much of that as there is. I just would have liked to see it spread a little bit more evenly. The last episode in particular is very action heavy, and I started to get pretty bored by it because it was sort of counter to everything else that had come in the rest of the episodes. So, it's not a huge problem, but I wish they had done that a little bit better. As far as the plot itself, it's pretty uncomplicated in its core arc. The complication really comes in a lot of the sort of ensemble cast and the various side stories or side investigations that happen as a result of the core plot line. And so it has its ups and downs in that regard, because I think it's pretty easy to see how the core plot line is going to play out from the very first episode. But again, for better or for worse, some of those side stories are a little bit I don't know. They're a little bit unsatisfying when they only last for an episode or maybe an episode and a half. I did watch a couple of these episodes back to back, and so I don't have a really clear delineation between what fits in an episode and what doesn't. To me, narratively, this feels like one very long movie, so to speak. There are breakups, there's breaks in the narrative that feel natural enough for an episode, but this is by no means a like episode of the week, villain of the week type of thing. This is very much one continuous narrative, and maybe I should have paid a little bit more attention to where the cuts were in episodes to notice, like, did that break off at what felt like a fair place. But since the main narrative that runs through it is the focus the entire time. It's always what those side plots are feeding back into. I'm not really going to give it a lot of leeway on that. That said, it's not problematic. It's just, yeah, a little bit less convincing in that regard. They sort of plaster right at the start of each episode that this is based on The Killing Floor, the first episode of, the first book of the Jack Reacher novels series. Something that I really didn't know about prior to looking it up after I had finished watching it. It is, like I said, it's the first novel, and reading through the summary, by all accounts, it sounds like they, for this show, followed the plot of the novel quite closely. Obviously, the summary being only a couple of paragraphs does not give me a full impression of it, but it seems pretty accurate. There is one particular change that I'm not going to say explicitly, but struck me as kind of weird upon reflection, where compared to between the show and the book, there is sort of a flip-flop between two characters who are present in both, but who sort of fill somewhat opposite roles. For some reason, I really don't know why they made that choice, unless they thought one of the character archetypes was going to be more compelling during a certain plot beat, but he was actually one of my least favorite characters altogether in the show, so I would have preferred if they had just kept with the narrative as it was. Minor thing, and probably would only bother book readers anyway, or you, now that if you're like me and now know the truth that they switched those characters. But I digress. Generally speaking, I think this is a well-paced, well-written, well-developed show. And that is a credit both to the screenwriters and the everybody involved with the production adaptation. It's also, of course, dependent a lot on your actors. And I am very happy to see, I wasn't 100% sure because I don't know much of anything about Jack Reacher, and so I don't know if he's characterized as being as big and strong and typical military guy as he is in this show. Alan Ritchson is an interesting casting choice. Historically, he's been cast in a lot of things where, of course, his size is a notable aspect of the property. I'm trying to remember if there's anything we've watched that's had him in it, but I didn't look that up ahead of time. I'm not going to spend the time right now. It is also particularly notable as a comparison to what's his name? Tom Cruise. Because Alan Ritchson is like 6'4" or something and built like nothing else. Like he's built like a very large football player type man. He is very, very muscular. He even the way he walks, and I don't actually know, I haven't watched enough things with him in it to say whether this is just him or this was his physical acting, but he walks with his arms out like he can't put them to his sides. It's just a fascinating thing, and no shade against him for that. It's just really noticeable when he's just walking around, and he's frankly almost gorilla-like in like his movements, because his arms just do not lay the same way a person without that same musculature would carry themselves. So just interesting in that regard. Compared to Tom Cruise, who is a notably tiny man. I think he's like 5'2" or 5'3" or something like that. And no shade against him either, but like he's not an imposing figure, even with the movie magic they do to put him in lifted shoes and apple boxes and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't have the physique. He has the physique of a guy who's fit, but not, he's not physically imposing really in any way. you can make him taller, but you can't make him look larger in every way, in every scene, to everybody he's up against. And I think that's particularly notable for it. Whatever property he's in, sometimes that's fine. But I think as a reflection between his Reacher and Richson's Reacher, it's a stark contrast. It's also really interesting for me personally to note how much more I like Richson as an actor. I've only seen him in like a few things, and I like him a lot, but also he's just a much more dynamic and charismatic actor than Tom Cruise is. I don't know why there's been this. I get that Tom Cruise has been called one of the the Hollywood leading men for decades now. I never really got it. He's very much in that vein to me of guys who basically only play themselves. And there's sometimes he's totally fine as that, and sometimes he's deeply unconvincing. And to me, a leading man typically has to be a little bit more charismatic than I find Tom Cruise to be. And it's funny because they easily could have framed Richson as a much more sort of gruff character, and he is a little bit, he's a little bit less he doesn't speak a lot. He's subtle and careful with when he speaks and what he says. He chooses his words carefully. If you've seen the show, that'll probably give you a chuckle. But he has much more physical charisma. And I'm not just talking about like he's a more appealing physical specimen. I genuinely mean like he gives off more character and warmth and like depth in just his facial like his facial acting and stuff like that. Even when he's being sort of gruff with somebody, in those moments he still seems to have more character and more care in that engagement, and he feels much more human to me than Tom Cruise does, which is weird even with the way they frame and show him. But I've been talking too much about Tom Cruise. I really like Alan Ritchson in this role. I do think that the character in the show could be developed a little bit more, but I think I understand why they frame him the way they do. In a lot of ways, Reacher in this show is more of a Max Rostansky kind of character, where he's more of a he's less the driving force of the narrative. He's less the one deciding everything to do, and more of an observer, a participant, but still an observer whom things happen to. Not to the extent of Mad Max, but like he certainly lets, there's plenty of room, and a lot of the other characters I would say have more character development overall, but just generally lead the plot more. In particular, Malcolm Goodwin and Willa Fitzgerald, who are both characters who are introduced in the first episode. That's Roscoe and Finley. They are great. I'm going to go ahead and say pretty much everybody in this show is at the very least pretty good to great, but those two in particular really carry this show, really give something for Reacher to play off of, because he is sort of this charismatic, but in a gruff kind of way character. They give him the opportunity to reflect as a sort of a reflection of his strengths and weaknesses, whether that's his experiences earlier in life, or any of the things they do some flashbacks to earlier in his life, which are a little bit clunky, but I think work fine as sort of a developing an origin story for a character who is kind of restricted in his performance. And so having these other two characters and these other two actors who are very good in their roles to play off of, and the whole cast in general to play off of, it really works well. The synergy, the chemistry between all of them works very well. Same goes for a bunch of the more minor characters. I think are also very good. Some of them are just fine, but some of them are really quite good. And I was just happy to see that this wasn't another case of, buff white heroic guy gets to be the savior of everything. This movie or this show really did surprise me with how much time it spent in dynamics between characters and with character development and genuine, even-handed help between characters who have have different strengths and weaknesses and assist each other or, counter each other in terms of what they're capable of or aren't capable of. Reacher is ultimately there mostly to be muscle, but often he also has a very intelligent side. I sort of wish the show even had more willingness to give him those moments of really great insight and intelligence, and maybe moderate them a little bit, because it really flip-flops from 0 to 100 on those in some cases. But again, that's a minor nitpick. What else about this show? Yeah, I guess all the actors I think do things really well. I think that between both sort of talking scenes and action scenes, they do a pretty good job both of transitioning between the two and of executing both. I think that the writing holds up plenty well when two characters are having a genuine deep back and forth, whether that's a positive one or a negative one. I think they work it out pretty well. And actually one of the biggest complaints, but still a relatively small complaint I have about the show, is that the action scenes feel not great. They feel a little cheap sometimes, especially towards the end. They make it pretty clear that they had higher aspirations than they were really capable of. And this movie, or this show, definitely succumbs to the same Hollywood standards of having a lot of action scenes with a lot of cuts in them, a trend that I continue to not really like. But they are not nearly as aggressive in a lot of cases as they are in a lot of Hollywood films. I would like to have seen much more grounded combat when they decide to get into a fight in whatever form. There were some times when it got a little bit silly, mostly towards the end of the series. The longer the series goes on, the more bombastic they feel they need things to be. But that is where I both get bored and start picking at, oh, that doesn't make sense. Oh, why didn't they have to reload? Oh, why did that guy randomly get the upper hand in that scenario on a hit that he shouldn't have been able to make, etc., etc. And so I start nitpicking that stuff when I get less compelled by it. So it's just not quite good enough to swing as hard as it does. Frankly, I don't think it needs to go that hard. And maybe in subsequent seasons, they are a little bit more moderate in that. I would like to think that enough people notified them about sort of the end of the series and their impressions of it that maybe they didn't go so far the next time. But yeah. On that subject, use of CGI is fairly sparing in the show, as far as I can tell. There are a number of shots that are mostly or completely CGI, and mostly they're okay. They're not like bad, but they don't have a full, Hollywood AAA movie kind of polish. And mostly that's fine because they're used fairly sparingly and fairly briefly. But again, at the end of the show, there are a couple of scenes, one in particular, where there is very heavy use of CGI and it looks really bad. And it culminates in a particular shot that if you've seen the show, you'll know that just, I literally yelled out loud, "You've got to be kidding me," because it looks so bad. I just wish they hadn't done, and it's so, even if it had looked good, that shot itself is such a trope, such a joke of a trope, that they just shouldn't have done it. Even if it was written into the book, they just shouldn't do it. It's too tropey. So it looked really bad. And when the scene leading up to that really had a lot of things that didn't look very good, that was a hell of frankly, a wet fart to put at the end to end things on. So anyway, I digress on that particular subject. Generally, the rest of the production looks good, though. They don't have a ton of locations, but they do have enough to feel like they are moving around a lot of the different locations they're saying they go to, whether it's different places in one town or other places nationally or internationally. They don't overstep their bounds too much with that, and they are smart with how they shoot and frame certain things to not to hide their budget or lack thereof. So I think that's totally serviceable. Likewise with costuming and makeup and stuff, I think that is a lot of good work is put into those things to both for practical stuff like what people wear and how they carry themselves and what that says about their character, sort of showing instead of telling about certain aspects of characters and places, and also some really good practical work with this movie, or the show does have quite a bit of violence in it, and it doesn't shy away from explicitly showing violent things. It doesn't. I was actually worried it was going to, but it managed not to stray too far into the glorifying violence, or putting it there for shock value. It's real close in some moments, but they are moderate enough with it that I think it works out okay. And the practical effects and makeup work and stuff that they put into all those things make it all feel valid. So I'm never upset about that, even when things are kind of grotesque. The rest of the cinematography and stuff I think is all kind of fine. It's not really extraordinary in any particular way. It does what it needs to do. I think there are some scenes that are actually, there's quite a lot of scenes that I think are a little bit darker graded than they need to be. But they don't ever stoop to one of my pet peeves, which is day for night. They don't ever do that as far as I could tell, or anything like that. So everything's done fairly practically and reasonably and looks pretty good. I could nitpick particular shots or particular scenes that I think could have been done differently for more effect, but that would be really nitpicking. Generally, overall, I think the show is quite good. It generally knows how far it can and should go. It knows how to let things breathe. It knows how to let characters develop and pace things. It manages to do very tropey things a lot of the time without feeling sort of overdone or too tropey. They even have a romantic subplot, a thing that I often dread in things like this, that feels totally reasonable and earned, and not like a throwaway thing, just to engage a certain type of viewer who wants that, I think they make it work into the plot totally reasonably. And generally overall, while I have some small issues with it, I was pretty happy with this show. It's definitely the kind of thing I would like to watch the next seasons of. As I understand, there's 2 more seasons out already. And if they can improve on what they've already done here, which I imagine there were probably some hesitations and some budget restraints based on whether or not this would do well. So I would hope that experience and money would make a lot of my minor concerns go away with subsequent seasons. We'll see, and I may or may not bother doing episodes on that when I do get around to watching it. But yeah, I was pretty pleased with this, and it didn't do the usual action hero boring me to death with bad pacing and bad character development thing that I was worried it might. So yeah, pretty happy with this. Anyway, thank you all for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.